Black Lives Matter, now and always. The time for change has been here for a very long time. We live in a system that was built on racism and relies on bias to survive. The system will not overturn itself. It's up to we, the people, to do that. If you find that statement uncomfortable, ask yourself why. If you are making excuses for police brutality, ask yourself why. If you are more concerned with burning buildings than a human life, ask yourself why. This isn't about black versus white. It's about everyone against racism. How's it going, everyone? Welcome to the Charlie Chats Footy podcast. Charlie Casson here. Nice one for listening. Cheers for locking in. I hope you've all had a good week. Now, before we crack on, I've just got to say my mind was absolutely blown last week. You may have seen on Twitter, I posted about this, but for those who didn't, someone in Antarctica has been listening to the podcast. Now, there's a population, I think, in Antarctica of about 1,000 people, made up of scientific researchers or tourists. 1,000 of them, right? And one of them has tuned in, which is hilarious and bonkers at the same time. It would be silly for me to not try and track down this person. So please, if you're listening, drop me a message, tweet me, make yourself known. We need to chat. I want to know who you are, and I want to know what the hell you're doing in Antarctica during a global pandemic. And what led you to listening to the podcast? How did you hear about it? We could Zoom or Skype, and it could be the intro to next week's episode, maybe. Who knows? Just get involved, message me. This is episode 5. It's with an absolute chap. He is Sean Delaney. Sean is an actor from London and he is a massive Fulham fan. He plays Kenny in the Golden Globe and BAFTA winning TV series Killing Eve. If you've been hiding under a rock for the last 2 years and you haven't seen it yet, get yourself on BBC iPlayer after this episode. There's 3 seasons out there for you to binge. Sean also played Michael Carney in Jesba OF's play The Ferryman, which was in the West End, and most recently in New York on Broadway, which won Olivier Awards, and it won Tony Awards for the best play. Sean and I were actually at secondary school together, Finchley Catholic High School. He was 2 years above me, but we used to see each other in the performing arts block. We both went off to drama school to become actors, and 10 or so years later, he's here on my podcast, and we're chatting about football. So it's a bit of a full circle moment. It was great to have him on. We chat all things Fulham, from Division 3 to the Europa League final, beating Juventus at Craven Cottage, and his nervy trip back from Greece to try and get to Wembley on time for the playoff final. Will he make it? Who knows? You've got to listen to find out. I hope you enjoy it. Please keep supporting the show, share and subscribe. If you like it, scream about it on all the socials. It makes such a difference. I really appreciate all the support. Thank you very much. But without any further ado, this is episode 5 of the Charlie Chats Footy podcast with Sean Delaney. Shawnee boy, thank you for coming on, mate.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.
I'm going to start with a very simple question. Why Fulham?
It's a good question. I didn't have too much choice on the matter. In fairness to me, my granddad came over from Ireland in the 50s. And moved he was living somewhere in between Willesden and Kilburn. And he was a singer in the Irish dance halls, and there's a load of Irish dance halls down there and down in Hammersmith at the time. But during the day he was training to be a mechanic, and a lot of the lads he was doing his apprenticeship with were Fulham fans. And so they dragged him in. So there's like a mix between the Irish community that he moved into with his work community. I think when he first went, it was the time when Fulham had Johnny Haynes and George Cohen, who George Cohen was part of the 66 World Cup winning squad. And up until, it's a bit of trivia, up until I think maybe a year before, Johnny Haynes was captain for England at the time. And had a car accident and broke his leg, which is the only reason he wasn't in the 66 squad anyway. but arguably he was one of the best midfielders in the world at the time. And so I think my granddad saw these lads playing, particularly Johnny Haynes, kind of fell in love with the club, fell in love with the ground and the player. And that's all she wrote.
So growing up, what's your earliest football memory?
Ooh. I think it's definitely, I don't remember much about my first game of the cottage. I couldn't tell you what score it was. I know I was young. I know I was maybe 3, and we were in what would now be League 2. It was called Division 3 back then. And I think my only memory of it was staying after the game and seeing our goal scorer, who I think his name was Paul Moody at the time, was being stretchered off after the game. So that's my clearest memory. But I don't remember too much about the game, but I definitely remember a lot about the ground. And we've been quite a football heavy household up until that point. But that's definitely my first memory of football, I think.
So I'm sure I've seen a photo of you somewhere, either on your Instagram or Twitter, or maybe even an article somewhere of you as a young boy wearing a young Fulham kit with face paint on your face.
Yes, yeah, that was a couple of years after, I think. Do you know what? I have a feeling, because I'm not one for having my face painted very much anyway, even now. I think, if I'm right in my head, I think that was when we were sponsored by Pizza Hut, which I think was our first season in the Prem.
Iconic shirt.
It was an iconic shirt. Listen, I was looking back at a few of the shirts. I kind of feel like Fulham's kits have got slightly worse as it's gone on. I was looking at the old retro stuff, and maybe just because it's in fashion nowadays anyway. But like, God, we had some good kits. That Pizza Hut kit was obviously our first season in the Premiership for a long, long time. Premier League even, before I lose all your viewers. And we got to the FA Cup semi-final that year against Chelsea, and I think we went down to Villa Park, which I have a sneaky feeling was my first technical away game, or the first game away from the cottage. And we played Chelsea at Villa Park in the semi-final and got beat 1-0, I think by like a sceptical Louis Sahar own goal or John Terry header, a bit of both. I think that's when I got my face painted.
So who were the players in the squad that time then when you got promoted to the Premier? Because when I think of that Pizza Hut kit, like you said, I just think of Sahar, I think of Chris Coleman.
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, I was talking to my dad about this the other day. We kind of, as a Fulham fan, I never ever slag off any teams that have like come into money and done really well, because obviously my first season when I was like 3 going on 4, we were in Division 3. And then at the end of that season, and this was the first season that I started going regularly when I was like 4 or 5, we'd been bought by Al Fayed, who owned Harrods at the time. And so we were like this lower league club that had been bought by a billionaire. And I do remember, even at the time, I do remember it. Anytime anyone played against us who was half decent, we just went and bought them in the next transfer window. And so, God, that first season we went to the Prem, it just took another turn completely. Because I think in Division 1 or the Championship, as it would be now, we'd signed Chris Coleman, who was like a top half Premier League defender, because we had the money. We signed Lee Clark from Newcastle, I think, who is like a starting, like a kind of mid-table Premier League centre mid. And then when we went to and that was in the Championship, and we were just blitzing teams. And at that point we had Louis Sahar as well, who was on the reserves at Metz, or on the youth team at Metz, who obviously went on to be like, if he wasn't injured so much, I think would have been one of the best Premier League strikers ever. When we went to the Prem and we signed Van der Sar from Juventus, who the only reason he left was because they just signed Buffon for it was the most expensive goal in the world at the time, for 32 million. And then we signed Steve Malbronk, who was playing Champions League football for Lyon not too long ago. I thought he'd retired.
If you've been bought by, this billionaire who owned Harrods, you look at now when teams get taken over by big money like City, why didn't Fulham sort of, reach the heights that these other billionaire owners have done with their clubs?
Well, do you know what? I think we kind of teased it. We teased it a bit. I know we'll get onto this later, but bearing in mind, was it less than 10 years ago? Before that, I remember my dad telling me that I think that the season I first went to Fulham, or the season before, we were second bottom in Division 3, at risk of getting relegated down into non-league, and we lost at Christmas time to the team that were bottom. And then, obviously, within 10 years, we're in the Premier League. Within a couple of years of that, we're in the Europa League final. And then that Europa League final was the turning point, really. I mean, listen, like it gets a bit political, but Al Fayed had invested so much money into the club, was toing and froing as to whether he would continue investing. And then, more or less from that final onwards, I don't know if this is such a random link, but it's quite important to Fulham Football Club. But I don't know if you remember when Diana died in that car crash. Her boyfriend at the time, I think his name was Dodi Al Fayed, who was Al Fayed's son, and Al Fayed chucked loads of money investigating that crash and how his son died, and throughout it, kind of like fell out of love with like the United Kingdom as a whole, and particularly like the English monarchy, and his attitude towards England changed, I think, and suddenly it became about, well, I need to get a bit of my money back, and he started looking to sell, and at that point there was that turning point. I mean I know we'll get onto it, but that Europa League final, we played Atletico Madrid, and it was so funny because within 5 years of that, I think maybe even less, we were being relegated, and Atletico Madrid were in the Champions League final, and the difference was investment at that point. Al Fayed, and to be fair to him, like, not to be all little Fulham about it, but we little Fulham on the Thames had got to Europa League final, and Al Fayed had, nobody could complain about what he'd done for us, and I think he saw it as a way that he's kind of washed his hands of the club, and he's given us everything as football fans that we could ever have dreamed about. And then the investment stopped then. And also, I think at that point, a billionaire running a football club isn't really the exceptional thing anymore. Like everyone else caught up. Man City had been taken over at that point, and then suddenly there was this massive gulf, even within like financially and like the size of teams, where suddenly, like, if you're a Premier League team, the chances are you had a very, very, very rich owner. But the gulf in between that and the top, depending on who was willing to invest or not, and who had money to throw away, I think that was the big thing. Yeah,
it's interesting. Like you mentioned, we're going to touch on the Europa League campaign in a minute. But I just want to ask, like me with Barnet, I mean, you try to get to as many Fulham games as you can.
Yeah.
But obviously with our jobs, if you're in a play, the chances are you're going to be doing shows on a Saturday afternoon, which means no footy.
Yeah.
I certainly have, but have you missed any big games in recent years that, you were just absolutely devastated you couldn't get to?
Yeah. I mean, I missed some games I don't regret missing either. To be fair, it's like, it was a funny one. I did the Ferryman in town, and before I started it, we were, this is the season we got promoted. But before I started the job, we were mid-table. Like we were playing really well. We just weren't getting results, and it didn't really feel like I was missing out on too much. I just thought maybe that year wouldn't be our year, but luckily the Ferryman came around, and it was the most amazing job. And I don't regret missing the football. And luckily with the Championship, now and again you get one in every 2 games is a midweek game in the evening, and so you'd find a stream, or you find a channel showing it, and you'd be running up after you've seen up to the dressing room to try and check on the score and see what was happening. But almost from the day that we opened in like January or late December, early January, we went on this unbeaten run for more or less the rest of the season, and we went from kind of lower mid-table to third with a little push towards automatics at the end of it. And so I missed this entire unbeaten run, which to the point where, like, there's a little story in this. When we got to the playoff final, I was in Kos in Greece at the time, because about maybe two months into the run of the Ferryman, we all agreed to go on holiday after the show was done, and booked it. And at this point, we weren't even close to playoffs, never mind, challenging for automatics. But basically, I went on holiday knowing that we're in the playoff final, having booked it ages ago, and could not for the life of me find a flight home. for the final. And then, I left it for a couple of days while I was out there because I didn't want to be stressing out while I was on my holiday. And then luckily this flight, well, it was 2 flights appeared. And luckily it was a day before I was meant to leave anyway. But the playoff final was on, and it was the first time we'd been to Wembley since 1970. And also it was potentially the last time we'd get to Wembley, for my lifetime, knowing Fulham. And luckily I found this flight I travelled from a little airport in Kos into Basel airport in Switzerland, and then transferred over, and then from Basel into London, and which only gave me I think 2.5 hours to get home, shut my stuff down, and get to Wembley. And then there was a delay on the flight. We're on the plane waiting to take off, and a delay came on.
I'd be having a panic attack.
Oh my god, man! It was so stressful. That whole day was just, it was nuts. It's maybe one of my favourite footballing moments. But I was convinced I wasn't going to make it, and I'd spent money trying to get home in time for it. And also I didn't want to my dad and my brothers were there, and I didn't want to miss out on that. And luckily we arrived. I bombed out of the airport, managed to get home with maybe an hour to go before kick-off. And luckily I was living in West London at the time anyway, so it didn't take me very long. So I got there about half an hour, got to Wembley about half an hour before kick-off, sing to Guinness. And then if my heart rate wasn't through the roof already, obviously we were 1-0 up against Villa at Wembley, and we got Dennis Adoy sent off with about 20 minutes to go, which is the longest 20 minutes of my life, I think, to this day. Not that I change it though. It's an amazing way to get promoted.
What was that like, when the final whistle went and you find yourself back in the Prem?
Oh, it was emotional. I won't lie about that. I think me and my brother Ryan shed a tear or two. It's so much more than getting promoted during the playoffs. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. It's the least healthy way to, if you can get automatics, then do that by all means. But a trip to Wembley, and there was 40 odd thousand Fulham fans who I didn't even know existed in this wall of white at Wembley Stadium, and just the football we were playing at the time, and it wasn't necessarily that close a game until we got allowed sent off. But the whole season we were playing brilliant football, football capable of competing in the Premiership, I thought anyway. And so it was the fact that we kind of stuck to our guns, and we didn't let the moment the moment kind of get to us, and then just having 40,000 Fulham fans going nuts to the final whistle in Wembley Stadium, which you never thought you'd ever see in the Fulham capacity. So I remember because Wembley Stadium used to do all the concerts and stuff. I remember booking that, thinking, well, I might as well go there because I'm not going to go there as a Fulham fan. So, but it was well worth the wait.
So you find yourself, partying, celebrating at Wembley, getting promoted, and then fast forward a year, you're going back down. Why weren't you able to stay up?
It's difficult to know. I think it's a lot of things. I mean, listen, luckily in a similar way to the Ferryman in London that time, this is the positive side of it. I did the Ferryman in New York from December of that year as well. So I missed a lot of just after Ranieri came in, I missed a lot of that. And we were just getting battered, and it just wasn't fun. It's a difficult one. I mean, you'll know as well as me the whole immediate success in football nowadays. And maybe it's easier for us to look at it from a different viewpoint because we support teams that haven't always had success. But it's just the idea we got all this money to go to the Prem. We'd invested loads. We'd bought all these players. I think we'd bought too many players. Some of them are, who didn't look very good for us, are having an amazing season in the top flights of various leagues at the moment. If you overhaul your squad so much, which we had to, we had a lot of loans and we didn't have a big squad when we got promoted. But then you've got to make sure those guys gel in time. And we bought a lot of late transfer window, on the last day. But I think we signed 4 or 5 players. And so there was that. Slavica Jukanovic, who was the manager who got us promoted. I have to say, because I remember going to our first game in the Prem against Crystal Palace at home, and I think we lost 3-1. And they had 3 attacks the whole game. We were playing such brave football. We were just going out to outclass and outscore everyone. But every time we got countered, teams would score against us. And I do feel like if we kept Slavica for longer, it would have clicked in and we would have maybe stayed up. When Ranieri came in and Ranieri did that typical kind of manager's thing of finding the favourite player from the manager before and isolating him to make a statement, and then going all defensive for a team that can't defend anyway. We had Ryan Sessegnon at the time, who I think is still recovering confidence-wise from what Ranieri did when he came in.
He was flying.
He was flying. He's don't get me wrong. Listen, the Premier League was a big step up for him, a big step up for all of them. But especially at that young age, when like confidence and playing time is a big thing, having another manager come in and going, "Nah, you're not ready yet." I mean, you got us here, and you've kept us in it so far, but you're not good enough, or you're not experienced enough. It does a lot of damage, and just and we suddenly went from. I mean, if Fulham, no matter how bad we've been, and no matter how low we finish in the table, there is a real pressure on any manager to play attractive football, because we'd rather as fans collectively, and I hope I speak for most of us, we'd rather go and see an attractive brand of football that we in our recent history we've always had, no matter what level we've been at, and failed trying that, than turning into any kind of like long ball, two banks of five. I find it. I mean, maybe I've been spoiled otherwise, but I find it very boring. I don't think it's a very Fulhamish way of going about things.
Fulhamish. That's a new one.
It gets chucked around a lot now. It's become a bit of a word for us Fulham fans in terms of anything that like all this the football stopping as soon as Fulham start to click into some sort of gear. I mean, obviously this pandemic is crap for all of us, but timing wise, it feels like a very Fulhamish thing. Like a Fulhamish thing would be to go and batter Millwall 5-0 and break records for possession stats in like the Football League history, and then the next week go away to Barnsley and get battered. That's a very Fulhamish thing.
I'll tell you what wasn't a very Fulhamish thing.
Yes,
and that was getting to the Europa League final.
No,
in 2010.
That was nuts.
I mean, let's talk about that. It's a couple of weeks ago. You had the 10-year anniversary of that final versus Atletico, which you mentioned about in Hamburg, which we'll get to in a minute. But I want to start with the campaign itself, and I think there's no better place to start than the last 16 against Juve. Just talk me through those two legs, because I mean it was pretty bonkers.
It was nuts. I mean, I'm glad you started there, because we had to qualify for it. So our pre-season was spent flying around Eastern Europe and like random places qualifying for the Europa League. Never mind, starting at the group stage.
You had Vetra and won 6-0 on aggregate, and then you went to Russia and played Amkar Perm.
Jesus.
And won 3-2 on aggregate, 1-0 away and 3-1 at home. And then you obviously got put in a group with Sofia, Basel, and Roma.
Yeah, which was a hard enough group anyway. And then before the Juventus, I think the game before Juventus, we played Shakhtar Donetsk, who have been in and around the Champions League, forever. In fact, I think the reason we played them was because they finished third in their Champions League group that season. Maybe the best team I've seen at the Cottage, maybe ever. And that up there with the Man Cities and the Liverpools, and the Fergie Man United squads that I've seen. They absolutely battered us. And they had like a young Fernandinho, and they had Willian, and they just had a load of young Brazilian kids who have now gone on to be like megastars. But they battered us, and we beat them, and I think that was a big thing, like confidence-wise. That last 16 was when it started turning into like, well, we'd beaten all these teams that everyone had written us off against, and Juventus was the pinnacle of that. And we were quite confident going into the away leg, and then they just battered us. I think
just talking about that away leg. You go to Turin, right, and after that game, you've lost 3-1.
Yeah.
If someone had said to you that night, after that first leg in Italy, that you'd be in the final, you would have just not believed it.
No, not at all. I mean, I'd love to know what the bookies would have said at that point. I'd be a rich man now, but
just knowing that after that game, you knew you had to go to Craven Cottage and score 3.
Yeah, and then we went 1-0 down in 2 minutes.
Trezeguet, yeah,
at home, and that was the other thing. Is like, God, as stressful as it was and as magic as it was, some of the players that turned up to Craven Cottage that season, was just nuts. And obviously we knew we were playing Juventus, and we had Cannavaro had just won the World Cup as captain for Italy, against Bobby Zamora of all people. And you kind of go, well, we love Bobby Zamora. Bobby Zamora is ours, but when you put him up against a World Cup winning centre back, like where this is where we get engulfed a bit. And after that first leg, it really did feel like that. It kind of felt like it was one step too far. But then that night at the cottage was just unbelievable.
Were you there?
No, I wasn't. 2 games I missed because of, I think I was either doing my GCSEs or my A-levels at the time. I think it was my A-levels. And bless him, I mean, my dad's always taken me to Fulham, and is half the reason I'm such a big fan anyway. But, at that time, seemingly important qualifications to get at the time. Not that it's done me any good.
You should have gone down to the White House at school, had a knock on Mr. McKenna's office and said, look, come on, sort me out.
Yeah, I know. I should have. Because it was at that time, I was only just getting into acting at that time. So I was like 17, 18. And I knew I wanted to go into it as a career, but I didn't have any experience in it to kind of back me up at all. Or to like justify to my dad as to why my levels wouldn't mean anything, so that I could go to Fulham. But I watched it from home on my, like, standing on my sofa with anxiety, and he was home late that night, if I remember.
It was going to extra time. Yes. Until Dempsey scored.
Yeah.
Didn't they have 8 men or something, or 9 men?
They had 9 men by the end of it. So Cannavaro got sent off after our second goal, because seemingly everything he did to Bobby Zamora in the first leg, where he just bullied him, Bobby Zamora got absolute revenge and just absolutely bullied Cannavaro for the first 20 minutes. And then Cannavaro lunged in on Guerra, I think, who was the last man running in, to stop us getting a third or a second, and got himself sent off. And then the whole momentum changed. And from that point on, you started to believe that maybe we could turn this around. And even in extra time, the fact that we had another man, if we can nick a goal late. But obviously Dempsey scored that unbelievable chip. And it was nuts because Dempsey didn't play a lot that season. It was really weird for a player who's obviously like as well renowned as he is, and went on to Tottenham afterwards. And, a couple of seasons later was like our player of the season. But he came off the bench and a couple of times that season did little stuff like that. It was nuts. You obviously
could beat Juventus, crazy night at the cottage, into the quarterfinals.
Yes.
We're going to just skim over this one. And then you get Hamburg, who at that stage in the semi-final, I know Atletico was still in there, but everyone's sort of, the bookies' favourites to get to the final would have probably been Atletico and Hamburg, because Hamburg were hosting it.
Yeah.
So obviously you go there in the first leg, draw 0-0, and then tell us what happened at the cottage.
Oh, so I was there for that night. That was nuts. It's maybe one of the best nights at Craven Cottage in our history, I think. Again, we went 1-0 down. Mladen Petric scored this free kick from about 30 yards away into the top corner. And it was nuts because, typically if anyone scores a 30-yard screamer against you, you kind of just, you sit back and go, well, okay, it's been nice while it lasted. And you don't save those. So, fair enough. It's been nice. Like, what a great thing to talk about. And then maybe about 3 seconds after the goal, and I have to say the away fans throughout that whole season in the Europa League were nuts. They were so brilliant. You kind of get like all those different cultures, footballing cultures from like European teams, and how much it means to them. And even the teams we were beaten, comfortably would come to the cottage and they'd be so loud the whole way through. And there'd be flares going off. But so anyway, the Hamburg fans were going nuts. And then this chant started, and it's a bit iconic now in football history. I'm not a big one for like reminiscing on chants or songs and stuff like that. But this chant started off in the back of the Hammersmith end where I stand, and it was like, "Stand up if you still believe." And unfortunately, I mean, the thing with Craven Cottage, so you got a lot of people, even in the European nights, would have a lot of people sitting, especially along the Thames and the Riverside stand and the Johnny Haynes stand. And it's like, so this chant, "Stand up if you still believe," and just went on and on and on. And we kind of drowned out the away fans cheering their goal. The whole of the cottage stood up and stayed up for the rest of the game. And then it's just like we cranked into a different gear and just absolutely battered them. like relentlessly for the rest of the game.
Two really quick fire goals because obviously at 1-0 down, you're out. But, you know, 65 minutes on the clock, 1-0 down.
Yeah.
Knowing you've got to score 2 in half an hour.
Yeah.
And then to get 2 goals in the space of 7 minutes. Yeah. It must have been crazy.
It was nuts. Yeah, I mean, it was on the Fulham website, replayed it the other day on its anniversary. And I forget how old our squad was. You know, we had a whole team of players who were at one point really, really good and playing in like top level prem teams who'd all come towards the end of their career to kind of give themselves another kickstart again and play under Hodgson, who was very tactical. But I just remember that first goal. I remember watching it from the cottage and Danny Murphy, who was our captain at the time, putting this long ball over the top, which we didn't often do.
I'm sure Van Nistelrooy was up front.
Yeah, he was.
He was, wasn't he?
God damn, I know, like some of the players there. I mean, Van Nistelrooy was obviously towards the end of his career a bit, and he had a history of just battering Fulham as well. So yeah, Simon Davis got that equaliser, and then it kind of just felt like we were going to do it. That's really odd. It just felt like the whole footballing world, and they were at that point. I remember, Fulham had become. I mean, Liverpool were in the other semi-final, but a bit of people. It felt to me like the football community had really got behind the idea that, that the little club in London had gone from the qualification processes to the semi-final, and were in touching distance of a European final, and it kind of just felt like the whole world wanted us to go through. And then Guerra got that winner, and I've never seen anything like it.
Do you remember if the Liverpool Atletico semi-final was the night before or the night after? Like, did you know who you were going to be playing in the final at that point?
I think they were the night after. They were definitely the night after, because there was that natural anxiety of there's that thing of like, well, we don't want to go to, as great as it is to get to the final. And obviously we weren't too delicate about who we were playing, and to get there in the first place was amazing. But if you were being like really romantic about it, playing another team from England who have beaten you a lot in previous seasons would kind of diminish the idea of going to Hamburg to have another European night again, to have an all English night. And also just in terms of for presence, I mean, because Liverpool have such a huge fan base. And this is the point. So like the other funny thing about it is that I think in Hamburg in the final, I think there was up to 10,000 Liverpool fans there, even though they didn't get there.
Who had bought tickets?
Yeah, because they'd already booked flights. They were convinced they were going. So they were the night after. And also I think in a funny way, I mean, we underestimated them. I mean, we clearly did. But I think we were hoping, like Liverpool had beaten us in the league. That's it. I think we'd drawn against them and they'd beaten us. So I think optimistically we were hoping for Atletico to then come out, because we thought we'd have a better chance against them. So they were the night after. And then obviously Atletico got through, I think, in extra time.
Yeah, they did. Diego Forlan scored twice.
God, Diego Forlan, man. That guy still haunts my dreams. He does.
It was 1-1 until, extra time. You've done well. But I'm just looking at the teams now. I don't know if you remember this. In that Atletico team on that night, 10 years ago, you had a 21-year-old Sergio Aguero up front. Yeah. You had a 20-year-old David De Gea in goal. You've obviously got Forlan, Simao. You remember Simao? Yeah. He was there. Reyes was playing. Rest in peace to Jose Antonio Reyes. Yeah. But I mean, you got all these world-class players, and you look at your team, Chris Baird and Aaron Hughes.
Yeah.
Up against, Aguero and Forlan.
That was it, man.
Do you feel like, you were out of your depth?
Do you know what? I think by that point, like, Fulham fans didn't know what being out of your depth was anymore. Because it's the same thing with, like, I mean, Hamburg had Zé Roberto in midfield. They had Zé Roberto, that might have been Wolfsburg. But they had Jerome Boateng at the back. They had Mladen Petric, who was like one of the top Bundesliga scorers at the time, who scored the free kick against us, and Ruud van Nistelrooy. And then before that, with Wolfsburg, who had a young Edin Dzeko up front, who was bagging it in. Also, Wolfsburg had won the Bundesliga. It was the first time Bayern or Dortmund hadn't won the Bundesliga the season before. And so they dropped out because they finished third in their Champions League qualification groups. But they were German champions. I think they had Barzagli, the Italian centre-back, who played for Juventus and won a Champions League, or got to Champions League final with Juventus not too long ago. He was playing for Wolfsburg. And then obviously you've got, the Juventus team speaks for itself. David Trezeguet and Del Piero came on towards the end. Cannavaro was obviously centre-back and captain. Buffon was playing in goal for the first leg and got injured, thank God. Some of the teams, like some of the players that we came up against that season. But then, listen, and Sergio Aguero, at the time we didn't have a clue about. But God, he just taught, like, Fulham got his name on the team sheet, but I think their man of the match that day was this Sergio Aguero, like this little lad who was just stronger than everyone else, quicker than everyone else. Picked on Chris Baird, unfortunately. And I think also by the end of that final, it felt like we were playing to leave it up to penalties and hope the footballing gods were with us again. You know, I mean, Fulham have never been in many penalty shootouts in my lifetime, but it feels like a very English European final thing to do, is to get to penalties, it seems. Also, like, for any one player to be responsible for losing a final based on a missed penalty, or you kind of just wouldn't wish that on anyone, especially that Fulham team who had got there in the first place, because suddenly to have one person to pin it on for missing a penalty.
Was that campaign a Roy Hodgson masterclass, or was it, you know, it was just luck? What was it?
I think I'd be lying if I didn't say it was a bit of both. You know, Roy Hodgson, you know, he's had a bit of a tough time of it since. You know, the season before, the reason we were qualifying for the Europa League is because we finished 7th. You know, that was back then when there was the obvious top 4, and then there was, I think, Liverpool and I think Liverpool in the top 4 at that time. But
you always had like Everton, Villa, City at the time who were sort of flirting with, you know, Europe.
And then Spurs, it was the start of Spurs starting to get quite good. But we finished above Spurs the season before, which is nuts to think, you know, where they've gone to now and where we've gone to. And so Hodgson had this way of playing. He's like, he had all these like really, really good, slightly aging, technically really, really brilliant footballers. Just drilled them so much. I was watching an interview with Bobby Zamora the other day, and he reckons by the end of like one season playing with Roy Hodgson, he would know how to play left back or right back in the Roy Hodgson team if he needed to. And also, it's like, if we ever got a goal against anyone, especially away from home, like, we were the masters of, like, apart from the Juventus game, of like an away team, of just like, you know, we'd save all the fancy stuff for the cottage and like the attractive football, but to go away and just shut teams down and just stop them from doing whatever they wanted to do. And obviously we had Breda Hangeland, who I think could have played at a higher level than us if he'd left after that season. He was too loyal. But suddenly, you know, I mean, you said earlier, like Aaron Hughes, you know, Aaron Hughes is like a decent, you know, should have been seen as like a decent Premier League centre-back, which he was. But that season, like under Hodgson, the two of them together were easily, like, you know, as we did, like an easily like top 8, top 7 centre-back partnership.
Well, hopefully, mate, the good days come back, because that was a special moment for Fulham and, you know, everyone associated with the club.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, listen, I'd love football back in some capacity, regardless of whether we're rubbish or not. I am missing it a lot at the minute. I don't know about you, but it's become very clear how embedded in our culture football is, I think, throughout all this, isn't it?
100%, mate. It's you realise how much of a big part it plays in your life.
Yeah.
I've realised how much I think about football.
Yeah.
Constantly.
Yeah.
And it's just not the same feeling waking up on a Saturday morning, you know, whether that be you go into the game or whether you switch on the telly. It's just emptiness, and there's nothing we can do about it. And the safest way going forward, who knows? But I just can't wait for that day to go down the Hive and or go to the pub and watch Sunday and just have a pint and watch the TV.
It really does kind of, this is really showing the gulf in between, like financially, between the top leagues and the bottom leagues. But what's happening with Barnet financially through all this? Is it hit them really hard? Or?
So I recorded with Darren Curry.
Nice.
And his episode came out a couple of weeks ago, and he was really honest. He gave a really honest interview, and I asked him about his future and, you know, whether he plans on being at Barnet long term. And he just said that he said he's been furloughed, and he knew as much as me. He was just really uncertain. All of our backroom staff got given their notice and when they're going to leave. I think it's had a massive effect on our academy, and for us, our academy is huge because we haven't got the funds to go out and buy big players. So we rely a lot on our academy. For example, we had a player called Jack Taylor, unbelievable player. Been with us since he was, I think, 16, 17. He's 21 now. We just sold him in January to Peterborough for 500 grand. And for us, that's huge to, you know, from nurturing a player and not spending a penny on him to getting 500k. It's a massive thing for us, but it's tough. No one really knows what's going on. And we've got a striker on loan at the minute called Paul McCallum. And I asked Darren if we were going to be keeping him. And he just came out and said he can't see it happening because of...
Well, that 500 grand you got as well. I mean, nobody can see this kind of stuff happening, but I take it that 500k is going to be eaten into to keep the club alive while all this is going on, right? So it almost becomes like a nullified transfer, right?
exactly. And there's teams down. To be fair, right, we're lucky. We're one of the lucky ones in non-league because we've got amazing facilities. It brings in money. There's a bar there. There's a gym there. There's a function room. There's always something going on. We are okay financially, but there's teams in our league. I mean, it's a bit like the Championship, right? It's very rare now. There's a team in the Championship that hasn't been in the Prem, and it's the same with the Conference. I mean, there's a lot of teams in the National League who have been in League Two, it's so tough to get out of. There's so many big clubs down there, but some of the clubs that aren't so big, your Barrows and teams like that, who financially, I don't know how they're going to survive. How they're going to survive as a club through this. It's tough. It's tough.
Because also at that level, I mean, players' wages aren't. It's one of the things that upsets me with like people always associate professional footballers with having like this amazing wage, but like at that level, it's like you're just getting by. And I remember watching that. I don't know what you think of it as a Barnet fan, but do you remember that Salford City documentary they made?
Yes, I do.
And I know they've kind of like, I mean, they're clearly a club that have just had investment chucked to them to trying to work their way up. But I remember it being really interesting when the decision to go from semi-pro to pro happened, because some players were getting more money doing their day job and playing on the weekend and getting a wage from the club as well than they would do if they just signed up for full time with the club. And the same with the managers and stuff like that. And you kind of realize, but it's not far away from that. And so it's really difficult because as a professional football player, if you've got a family to look after, particularly at that level, you can't afford not to be being paid or take a wage cut or any of that stuff as much as you love football, because, suddenly you chuck family in the mix and you realize that there's things a lot more important.
So just before we finish, Sean, I want to wrap up. I've got one last question that I've been asking all my guests who come on. You've got to pick one player, past or present, right? You can play them on a big screen in a biopic of their life. Who are you going to play?
Oh, who could I realistically play, casting wise, or who would I?
Our mate Ed, a couple of weeks ago, right? He said he'd play Adriano.
Oh my god! Oh god! I mean,
we've sort of got to throw casting out the window here.
Okay,
it would be tough to put your finger on that. I mean, go for the story, the story you want to portray, the stories you've heard or things you know about.
I think it's quite easy. In my head, I'd love to be. I think it'd be a pretty boring biopic, but I'd love to be handsome enough to play Scott Parker. I think, because I also think Scott Parker looks like he's an extra taken out of Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers. Doesn't he just look like a 40s like mid-war young lad?
His player as well, and he used to just have his shirt tucked in.
Like, he's so old school, like hair perfectly combed over, like none of this ticky-tacky nonsense. Where he could do it, just like getting stuck in, shirt tucked in, always respectful. But I think biopic-wise, I mean, it's been done before. But George Best, hands down. What a fascinating life. But really tragic, unfortunately. That whole, he's kind of one of the first celebrity footballers, as it were. And obviously had a disease with the drink. But what a player. People always talk about that comparison as like, who's the best football player ever. And obviously you got Chuck Zidane's and Ronaldo's and Messi's into the mix now. But, the whole chaps on Maradona and George Best and Pele. But like back then, George Best was doing it hungover or still pissed. So God knows what he would have been like if they had him sober. And
I've always found it interesting because obviously football's evolved over the years. I've always found it interesting to see, your George Best, your Maradonas, your Bobby Charltons, your Pelés, what they would be like in their prime in a Champions League final now with Messi, Ronaldo. Well, it's strange because you just don't know.
Yeah, you don't at all. I think we'd be surprised by like what players have been more efficient for today's game than before. I mean, also, you stick Messi in back then when they're not as protected as players, and you see some of the tackles that George Best had put in on him. You kind of go, Messi gets chopped in half for not even a yellow if he goes into back then.
All right, mate. Nice one, Sean. Thank you very much for coming on. It was lovely.
No, likewise, Charlie. Thank you so much. This is class. This is the closest thing I've had to football in ages, mate. So it's been much appreciated.
Today's podcast is presented by Podgo. Podgo is the easiest way for you to monetize your podcast, providing podcasters with a flat rate for ad space so you know exactly how much you're going to get when you include an ad from Podgo. I recently joined as a member, and you can too. Apply today to become a member and immediately be connected with advertisers that fit your audience. That's podgo.co. podgo.co.